Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and today we're bringing you the final part in our 5-part adaptation of The Crooked Man, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Sherlock Holmes has been hired to investigate the apparent murder of Colonel Barclay, the decorated commanding officer of the Royal Mallows, a British Army regiment. The colonel died in his own home following a violent argument with his wife, Nancy, during which she shouted the name David. Despite the strange evidence uncovered at the crime scene, the comatose Nancy Barclay remains the prime suspect in her husband's mysterious death. Holmes and Watson have tracked down a man who seems central to the case, Henry Wood, a mutilated and deformed former soldier, a beggar who entertains the troops with magic tricks and a trained pet, a crooked man who has agreed to tell his extraordinary tale, if only it might help Nancy Barclay. Holmes and I stood before the fire in the overheated room and listened with rapt attention as Henry Wood, twisted around his mutilated back, told his extraordinary story.
It was in this way, sir. You see me now with my back like a camel, and my ribs all awry. But there was a time when Corporal Henry Wood was the handsomest man in the 117th foot. We were in India then, in cantonments, at a place called Bertie. Barclay, who died the other day, was sergeant in the same company as myself. And the belle of the regiment, and the finest girl that ever had the breath of life between her lips was Nancy Barclay, the daughter of the color sergeant. There were 2 men that loved her, and one that she loved, and you'll smile when you look at this poor thing huddled before the fire and hear me say that it was for my good looks that she loved me.
Though Wood had Nancy's heart, her father was set upon her marrying Barclay. Wood was a harum-scarum, reckless lad, and Barclay had had an education and was already marked for the sword belt. But the girl held true to Wood, and it seemed that he would have had her when the Indian Mutiny broke out and chaos was set loose in the country. They were shut up in Bertie, the regiment with half a battery of artillery, a company of Sikhs, and a lot of civilians. There were 10,000 rebels around them. In the second week of the siege, their water ran out, and it was only a question of whether or not they could communicate with General Neal's relief column, which was moving up country. It was their only chance, for they could not hope to fight their way out with all the women and children. So Wood volunteered to go out to warn General Neal of the danger. His offer was accepted, and he talked it over with Sergeant Barclay, who was supposed to know the ground better than any other man, and who drew up a map by which Wood might get through the rebel lines. At 10 o'clock that same night, he started off upon his journey.
There were 1,000 lives to save, but it was of only one that I was thinking when I dropped over the wall that night, and it was Nancy's.
His way ran down a dried-up watercourse, which he hoped would screen him from the enemy's sentries. But as he crept round the corner of it, he walked right into 6 of them, who were crouching down in the dark, waiting for him. In an instant, he was stunned with a blow and bound hand and foot. But the real blow was to his heart and not to his head, for as he came to and listened to as much as he could understand of their talk, he heard enough to tell him that his comrade, Sergeant Barclay, the very man who had arranged the path that he was to take, had betrayed him by means of his Indian servant into the hands of the enemy. Wood sighed at the painful memory.
Well, there's no need for me to dwell on that part of it. You know that what James Barclay was capable of. Bertie was relieved by Neal next day, but the rebels took me away with them in the retreat. It was a long year before ever I saw an English face again. I was tortured and tried to get away and was captured and tortured again. You can see for yourself the state I was left in. Some of them that fled into Nepal during the reprisals took me with them, and afterwards I was up past Darjeeling. The hill folks up there murdered the rebels who had me, and I became their servant for a time until I escaped. But instead of going south, I had to go north until I found myself in Afghanistan.
Wood wandered about in Afghanistan for many years and at last found his way back to Punjab, where he lived mostly among the native people and picked up a living by begging and the conjuring tricks that he had learned. What use was it for him, in his wretched state, to go back to England or to make himself known to his old comrades? Even his wish for revenge against Barclay would not make him do that. He'd rather that Nancy and his old friends in the regiment should think of Henry Wood as having died with a straight back than see him begging and crawling with a stick like a broken insect. They never doubted that he was dead, and he meant that they never should. He heard that Barclay had married Nancy and that he was rising rapidly in the regiment, but even that did not make him speak. Wood sighed deeply and huddled up before the raging fire in the grate.
But when one gets old, one has a longing for home. For years, I've been dreaming of the bright green fields and the hedges of England. At last, I determined to see them before I died. I saved enough to bring me across, and then I came here, where the soldiers are, for I know their ways and how to amuse them, and so earn enough to keep me living.
Your narrative is most interesting. I've already heard of your meeting with Mrs. Barclay and your mutual recognition. You then, as I understand, followed her home and saw through the window an altercation between her husband and her, in which she doubtless confronted him over his awful conduct toward you. Your own feelings overcame you, and you ran across the lawn and broke in upon them.
I did, sir. And at the sight of me, he looked as I have never seen a man look before. And over he went with his head on the fender, but he was dead before he fell. I read death on his face as plain as I can read that text over the fire. The bare sight of me was like a bullet through his guilty heart.
And then?
Then Nancy fainted, and I cut up the key of the door from her hand, intending to unlock it and get help. But as I was doing it, it seemed to me better to leave it alone and get away, for the thing might look black against me, and anyway, my secret would be out if I were taken. In my haste, I thrust the key into my pocket and dropped my stick while I was chasing Teddy, who had run up the curtain. When I got him into his box, from which he had slipped, I was off as fast as I could run.
Who's Teddy?
The man leaned over and pulled up the front of a kind of hutch in the corner of the room. In an instant, out there slipped a beautiful reddish-brown creature, thin and lithe, with the legs of a stoat, a long, thin nose, and a pair of the finest red eyes that I ever saw in an animal's head. Why, it's a mongoose.
Snake catcher is what I call them, and Teddy is amazing quick on cobras. I've one here without the fangs, and Teddy catches it every night to please the soldiers in the canteen. Any other point you have questions about, sir?
Well, we may have to apply to you again if Mrs. Barclay should prove to be in serious trouble.
In that case, of course, I would come forward.
But if not, there is no reason to rake up this scandal against a dead man, foully as he has acted. You have at least the satisfaction of knowing that for 30 years of his life his conscience bitterly reproached him for this wicked deed. Ah, there goes Major Murphy on the other side of the street. Goodbye, Wood.
We were in time to catch Major Murphy. He greeted us with jovial excitement.
Ah, Holmes, I suppose you have heard that all this fuss has come to nothing.
What's that, then?
The inquest is just over. The medical evidence showed conclusively that death was due to apoplexy. You see, it was quite a simple case after all.
No, remarkably superficial. Come, Watson, I don't think we should be wanted in Aldershot any more.
There's one thing that still puzzles me, Holmes. If the husband's name was James and the other man was Henry, what was all this talk about David?
That one word, my dear Watson, should have told me the whole story. It was evidently a term of reproach.
Of reproach?
Yes, David strayed a little occasionally in his life, you know, and on one occasion in quite the same manner as Sergeant James Barclay. You remember the small affair of Uriah and Bathsheba? My biblical knowledge is a trifle rusty, I fear, but you will find the story in the 1st or 2nd of Samuel. Come along now, Watson. If we hurry, we can catch the 5:15 train and be home in time for supper.
And so we come to the end of our tale. After the doctors have ruled Barclay's death a medical accident, Holmes has no reason to betray Wood to the authorities and leaves the scene with the possibility that Wood and Nancy might once again rekindle their long-lost connection with one another. This is the final episode in our first season of BeFM Drama, but due to the popularity of the program and the requests of our listeners, we will rebroadcast our entire library of quality BeFM Drama programming in the new season. I hope that you'll be listening here as we begin again with BeFM Drama.